Okay, welcome everybody. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Any questions before I get going with chapter 11 material? Okay, so the focus of this is evolution and some details about it. And then we will, in the next chapter, talk a little bit about diversity, species diversity. So they are tied together. There are technically a handful of extra chapters that describe some more details, but we're not going to go into that material. It is there if you are interested in digging a little deeper. So there are all sorts of opportunities when we think about evolution and having, some potentials to witness some of this. I described a little bit last week, I think it was, when we talked about some of the fruit flies and some of the potentials to see some change, some variation in those populations of fruit fly, laboratory situation, not just wild, but where you can modify and manipulate these things based off of our own selective pressures, right? Really, when we think about stuff like that, and we're the ones that are the driving force or the one pushing this, we call that artificial selection because we are the catalyst for that change, if you will. If we think about the environment, if we think about changes occurring as a result of natural happenings, shifts in the environment as an example, we think of that stuff not caused by us, but by the environment. That's natural selection. And oftentimes, when we think evolution, we talk evolution and natural selection and kind of use that stuff interchangeably. It's not the exact same thing, all right? Natural selection is a driving force of evolution, but it's not exactly the same stuff, all right? So we'll go through and talk about that and some details about it as we progress through. So initially, as we start this off, we can think about life, and really, at the very start of this semester, which seems so far back now, at the very start of this semester, we kind of thought the littlest bit about life, about biology, the study of life. And this picture, or many pictures, this collage of life shows us all sorts of detail, all sorts of variation. And some of these things we may think maybe more about than others, right? As I thought at the start of this, many of us probably think about some sort of mammal when we think about life, and maybe not a bacterium. Not that these guys aren't important, right? So there's all sorts of possibilities. And when we think of it and look at all of the tremendous variation that we see, it's oftentimes hard to understand that we all are related. We all have some genetic similarity if we start tracing things back where we can see commonalities. We definitely step back and look now and we're like, well, there's definitely all sorts of crazy variation. How could that be? But over the course of billions of years, the potential for all sorts of different types of adaptations, changes to the given surroundings or environment sets the stage for massive adaptation, diversification. Things that we might describe in some instances as adaptive radiations, where you've got all sorts of diversification happening very rapidly, right? Oftentimes, when we think about change or evolution, if you will, it's very difficult to witness that happening. Change usually occurs gradually, slowly. over the course of numerous generations. And that has the potential to take a tremendous amount of time if you're thinking people, right? If we're talking bacteria, well, that's a different story. And you can get countless generations in a single day. Billions of copies of bacteria can occur, replicating every 20 minutes. Exponential growth can happen right before your eyes, right? There's definitely differences when we start thinking about the types of organisms, and we described a little of that already with sexual organisms, where we see fertilization contributing variation to those progeny, or like the bacteria, where we think of them as asexual. So a single cell is a clone of itself as they replicate countless times, and you get a visible colony of bacteria. They're all basically genetically the same. There are possibilities with change, with mutation, that can lend to variation, whether we're talking sexual or asexual species. So that's some of the stuff we want to kind of think about a little bit, all right? So these birds, these finches, were one thing that Charles Darwin, right here, the bald guy, Charles Darwin focused some of his research on, right? I want to keep it on this slide for 1 second, and then we'll flip back to the finches, all right? So this chapter doesn't have, at least my figures, doesn't have all sorts of details about Charles Darwin. It doesn't show pictures of the voyage that he took around the world on the ship called the Beagle, where he was able to study all sorts of different types of plants and animals, especially birds, but he looked at all sorts of other things and made all sorts of different findings as they traveled the globe, all right? So I want to tell a quick story about this to kind of set the stage about Darwin, and we'll think about Wallace as well, all right? So Charles Darwin, he came from a prominent family. His father was a physician, and I believe his grandfather before him sang. They had all sorts of hopes and aspirations for little Charles. His father expected that Charles would do something, that was good for the family name. What could you do? You could become a physician, just like your old dad. That's what you ought to do. And that was the pressures that were placed upon him. At the age of 16, he enrolls in medical school, which makes me just wonder what in the heck's going on here, right? Many of us at the age of 16 are not thinking about that, right? Definitely not, right? At least probably not, right? So he, like I said, prominent family. He gets into medical school. He finds himself fascinated with lectures in biology, but specifically thinking about things like, all sorts of diversification, all of the different types of animals. So what we think, now like zoology, looking at variation. He was fascinated with other like natural history stuff, geology, where they were talking about all sorts of change occurring over time and the potentials to see fossils, which when we think about looking at change is one of the key things that we try to unearth, to see some of these fossil remains and speculate on, living organisms potentially coming from these fossilized remains. And you can oftentimes see lots of similarities when you see this. So that's the initial pressure, all right, is medical school. And like I said, he finds himself interested in some aspects. But in medical school, one of the first things, especially back in the day, there were these very large surgical theaters where the physicians would be down below, and like a stage, they are performing these surgeries, all sorts of different things happening. And all of the students gathered around watching from, what's occurring from down below. This was also very different times than we think about today, where you can go in and get some anesthetic, you can get knocked out, and you can have this thing performed on you and wake up later and you're good to go, right? That wasn't the case, right? You potentially had something maybe you could bite down on as they're trying to amputate your leg, but they don't numb it, they just saw it off. And doctors of the time, they advertised in how quickly they could amputate a limb. Just so you know, you're not going to be dealing with this pain for very long. We cut your leg off in 5 seconds, right? Come to me, right? I'll lop that sucker off immediately, right? That's kind of crazy, right? And I imagine probably, a shot or two of whiskey helps all of that stuff feel just fine. There's issues with that and thinning your blood and causing other problems. But back then, who knew, right? So definitely different, definitely more gruesome and painful, and probably pretty disturbing to witness, right? Charles couldn't handle that. He couldn't stomach it. He found himself losing his lunch. He found himself passing out at the sight of blood. And for a medical student, that doesn't fly. He flunks out of medical school, not because he can't understand the material, he can't stand the sight of blood, all right? That is a mark against him. His dad is pissed off, all right? What are you gonna do now, little Charles? You obviously can't hack it as a doctor. Now what, right? This isn't a good thing for the Darwin name, right? So the next best thing, apparently, to being a physician would be a preacher, a minister of some sort. That is the second, as far as the levels of respect, second in line, right? Highly, still highly thought of, not quite as much as a doctor, but pretty stinking close. So theology is what he decides he will study, all right? He has already had a bit of a spark of interest in the life sciences and in some of these lectures that he was able to see at medical school. And he finds himself, as he's studying theology, kind of moving toward these other talks. Well, that's not really what dear old dad's hoping for, right? So he completes his theology degree, and shortly after, a mutual friend of the family, clues little Darwin in to this potential to be a naturalist, a scientist on this ship that's going to sail around the earth with really the idea of looking at South America, because England has all sorts of hopes and thoughts that there's numerous potentials. Gold is there, right? There's all sorts of thoughts, and they want to map the coast. They want to think about all of these different potential ports and places that they can come and colonize and conquer. That's the idea. So Darwin's role on this ship is to see what sorts of life forms are present in this new world, right? This new world of South America. Plants, animals, what sorts of resources are there for England to tap into? That's really what his job is, right? And as they travel, he collects all sorts of specimens, things that are unique and novel, things that have not been seen in London, right? All sorts of variation, right? And it starts sparking interest as he is sailing around. Like I said, he's already kind of had this stimulus in the first place. He took with him a handful of works, books to read on the ship, some about geology, others about like economics, which seems very different. But this sets the stage for kind of his initial thinking about change. All right. So sail around South America. They get to the Pacific Ocean side, make it up toward Ecuador, still finding all sorts of different specimens and fossils, so living and extinct things. And then they sail, start sailing west across the Pacific and come to the Galapagos Islands. These are a chain of islands, 14 or 15 islands, making up this unique opportunity for him to evaluate all sorts of differences. These islands are about 600 or so miles off the coast, quite a distance from the mainland. All right. So things that are on these islands have potentially some opportunities to change, to adapt, to be different than what he has found on the mainland. All right. We will a little later think about some of this stuff, and we think now kind of describing it as island biogeography. So these islands, these areas that are away from mainland, really some of the big ideas with this as we look at what's populating these areas is who gets there first? Who is the first whatever to colonize in this new untapped resource or habitat? And that sets the stage for the possibility of them filling all sorts of different types of niches or roles within that habitat. Now I want to flip it back one, all right? So as they get to the Galapagos, and again, a handful of different islands within this chain, there's all sorts of variation that he sees. And there are islands that are more desert-like. There are some that are more tropical. The types of vegetation on these islands are definitely varied, right? So the types of resources are also varied as far as what you might be able to tap into, all right? So he starts recognizing some finches. Before he sets sail, he had already kind of started thinking about birds and had a handful of different types of pigeons. He was a pigeon breeder and knew a bit about some of this variation that you could see in pigeons. They're more than just kind of gray birds, all right? There's all sorts of potentials with them, all right? So he recognizes that on the islands, there are all sorts of finches. But on the mainland, there's one type of finch. They all look the same, all right? So that starts making him wonder, why is it that the mainland, it's all the same, but the islands different? And as I said a second ago, this island biogeography idea is not something he came up with, but he starts thinking about change and natural selection. And ultimately, these finches were the first types of birds that made their way to the mainland, or to the island, excuse me, from the mainland. There are other birds on these islands, but they showed up later, and they look very similar to the mainland birds because those different roles, those habitats that were untapped, got tapped by the finches, all right? They brought with them to these islands variation within their genetics, within their genomes. There was already some potentials for some of the beak sizes to vary, for some other potentials, the body size, what they feed upon, seeds or insects. There are even some finches that are vampires. They take blood meals from animals, all right? very different than the mainland finch, all right? Some living on the ground, some living up in trees, all sorts of different types of habitats that these birds, all finches, but variation within them, that makes him start wondering, how is this change occurring, all right? So he gets back to England with massive amounts of data, all sorts of information, and thoughts about change occurring. This is an issue for him, and we need to flip it back and think about those pressures that his father was placing upon him, right? These are things that kind of plagued him, kept him up at night, right? Some of the stuff that he's thinking about, this change occurring, he's afraid that this is kind of going to go against the grain. This is something that some individuals might find blasphemous. How can you be saying that these things are happening without the pressures of some divine creator? How could this occur? All right. And ultimately in his works, he makes no mention one way or the other, all right, about that. That was also a potential issue, all right? So as he returns, I like to joke and say, he was a pretty good procrastinator. I think most of us probably would say, I'm pretty good at procrastinating, right? I'll put that off. I'll do that later, right? Research papers due in a week. The day before, I'm going to bust that sucker out, right? Maybe that's a good way to do it. I bet it's probably not the best, right? There was more to it than that, right? Definitely some of these pressures, some of these thoughts of going against the grain made him take this manuscript, made him take his document that he has written and put it away, right? He's going to sit on that for a little bit and not immediately publish, right? That's a potential issue when we think about scientific process. And oftentimes, when we think about doing science, you probably are not the only one that's got a similar sort of an idea and set up an experiment or gather data about these specific questions. And it's really kind of a race to see who is able to get that information out there first, right? So we keep that in mind as we see Alfred Wallace. He is another researcher. He has traveled around a bit. He didn't sail around the world, but he did travel around some parts of Europe. I think he also went down into Africa. He saw some variation as well as he went on these travels. He noticed some of these things, and it made him curious as well. He speculates, he starts to gather data, and he puts forth a similar idea as Darwin, and he writes this up, right? His manuscript, he's questioning, what should I do with this? Who should I show it to? Who better than Charles Darwin, a gentleman who has traveled the earth and found all sorts of information. He's a prominent scientist, and Wallace knows that. So he thinks Darwin would be the perfect person to read my manuscript and see if it's something that's worthy of being presented to the Royal Society, all right? Darwin gets this manuscript from Wallace, and as he reads it, I'm assuming his jaw drops open and he's like, what in the hell is this? This is my research. This is my stuff, right? I have made similar claims. I have the data to back it up, right? And now here he is with the same idea, right? He's beaten me to the punch, right? This is a big issue, all right? So Darwin collects his material. He takes Wallace's material and he goes over to the Royal Society, the Linnaean Society, and shows both of the works. The people decide this is worthy of being presented, and they invite both to present their findings, to talk about it, to discuss. We give Charles Darwin the credit He had traveled before. He had the data collected long before Wallace had written his manuscript. And we truly say these ideas are Darwin's ideas. Wallace came up with them on similar ideas on his own, but it was after the fact, basically. All right. It makes me wonder if what would have happened had Wallace submitted it to someone else or just forwarded it directly to the Royal Society. They read it and thought it was fascinating, and he presented it. Darwin wouldn't even be talked about here. He'd be a little blurb or a footnote in all of this. Like, oh, he also saw stuff, but Wallace would be who we think about and talk about with these ideas. I think it's kind of interesting, all right? So we give him credit, all right? Charles, we give them both credit, but we give Charles Darwin credit. He ultimately publishes this manuscript right after it's been presented to the society, or a few months after. And they say that basically, you know, we don't have New York Times bestseller at this point, but if we did, it'd be right up there, all right? Right at the top. They say it was the book that rocked the world. They couldn't publish it fast enough. As soon as they would get it published, it was sold out, all right? Everyone wanted this information. They were eager to learn about these details this scientist has come up with. And it truly starts this process of change, all right, as we start thinking about our ideas with how things occur, right? So I want to back it up for 1 second. We talked about Mendel. We talked about him as this father of genetics and studying peas and looking at patterns of heritability. Mendel and Darwin, they were alive at the same time. They were contemporaries, right? Mendel's works were technically, his writings were in Darwin's library, but he hadn't read them because Darwin isn't a mathematician. He's not thinking about that type of stuff, had no cares about what Mendel had said. Had he read that and understood the math behind it, these probabilities, it could have lent to a whole other chapter within Darwin's works that describes this is the process of how inheritance actually is happening in the first place, how we see this variation. You get 2 copies of your chromosomes, you get 2 copies of those genes, and that variation can be acted upon, can be selected for based off of environmental pressures. These 2 ideas get merged together in the very early 1900s, right? As we rediscover Mendel's works and say, wait a minute, think about it in this context, evolutionary context, and we merge these thoughts together and call it modern synthesis, right? This idea of how evolution can change through heritable information that's passed on from parents to offspring. It's pretty impressive stuff, right? So all of that to get 2 slides into it, right? Once Darwin made these claims and talks about the birds and the variation that they have seen, I feel like, and it's not actually true, but I feel like it was virtually the following year that scientists were like, oh, we've got to go to the Galapagos and set up some field stations. We've got to do some research. It wasn't that quick, but scientists have been flocking to the Galapagos to study things like these birds for a very long time, all right? Since the early 1900s, all right? So finches, amongst other things, have been studied in great detail. And like I said, there's variation on different islands as far as plants, moisture, all of that stuff. But if we look at the same island, all right, in this case, Daphne Major, in the late 70s, there are researchers that have been studying these things for decades and accumulating massive amounts of data. They recognized a drought that had happened in these islands that set the stage for change to be witnessed firsthand, if you will. So the beak size or the beak depth, as we look at these, here we've got 1976. This would be pre-drought. 1978 would be post-drought. 1977 was the bad year, all right? This stuff, as we look at it, it's fluid, all right? You've got the ability to adapt and change if these pressures are placed upon you, all right? There's variation in the beak size in both years, all right? As we look at it, all right? There's variation. There's some that have smaller beaks. There's some that have some pretty big beaks, all right? The average beak depth is about 9.5 millimeters, all right? This is pre-drought, all right? So the drought happens, a lot of the little grasses, a lot of those things that are more sensitive to these selective pressures, those temperature shift, they aren't able to survive and produce the seeds that the smaller beaked birds rely on. The bigger beaked birds can eat more hardier seeds. They can eat stuff that's maybe we could consider more drought tolerant, all right? And those smaller beaked birds just couldn't do it, all right? So the drought is the selective pressure, the environmental shift. The seeds that could be consumed was a driving force that led to bigger beaked birds having more nutrients, more offspring generated, and the following year, we see that shift in the size of beaks 2 years later. So 76, we're at 9.5 and pushing it to just over 10 millimeters. That doesn't seem like a huge shift, but if we look at the rest of the stuff, it is a pretty dramatic shift if we start looking at numbers, all right? There's still some variation for some smaller beak size. There's still some bigger beak size, all right? The variation is there, all right? And that's important when we think about natural selection and the ability to adapt, right? If you don't have variation within the population, your potentials for change to be able to adapt to that change is minimized dramatically, all right? So we could see this. We could flash forward and say, you know, a year later, it's a very rainy year. We've got lots of grasses, and we could see this pushing back, maybe even a little bit over, more toward the 9 range, because we favor now these smaller beaked birds because there's a boatload of small grass seeds, lots of ample nutrients for them, and it increases their population size, right? All sorts of things that we can start evaluating that are really natural selection, these driving pressures that cause or help steer adaptation or change within a population, right? And when we think about evolution, I mentioned population, it's not an individual that's evolving. You are not evolving. You have your own suite of genes. If you happen to reproduce, you pass those genes on, and those may be good copies, they may be bad copies, they may be something that we don't recognize either good or bad, right? It really kind of depends on those circumstances. And based off of that and the specific selective pressures, we can see the population shifting over the course of time, right? If we were to, you know, go back thousands of years, we would recognize ourselves, but not as much as we recognize if we walked outside and saw just a bunch of people, right? It would be different. Considerably more hairy, right? I could imagine, right? And maybe a little more scary, right? It kind of just depends, all right? Over the course of many, many generations, we see change, right? It makes me, you know, curious if we were to think 10,000 generations of humans later from now, how will we appear, right? Probably very different than we think of ourselves today, right? Will we still maintain any amounts of hair, or will it completely be gone, right? What will our size be, right? If we're looking at the United States, I think we may look kind of like seals. That's maybe not the best, right? So we will see. Here we can see a couple of different types of flowering plants, all of which evolving from a common ancestor. We call the flowering plants angiosperms. And there is all sorts of variation, but there's also lots of similarities. Although you look at these two and think they look very, very different, there are still similar features, reproductive structures. We're not zooming in to see that stuff, but similar types of morphology and function within them, right? And common ancestry as we look at DNA characteristics that show these features. This is, I think, a pretty impressive example as we think about it. And it's also a little disturbing. So these are a couple of moths. These moths are the same, but they look different. So same species, all right? So we can think England again, as we are right here, with these moths. And pre-industrial revolution, industrial revolution, and we technically ought to think post-industrial revolution. There should be another picture over here after this shift, all right? We'll get to that in 1 second, all right? So initially, before we think about big industrial revolution, before we think about massive amounts of coal being burned and spewed out, big factories pumping out all sorts of pollutants, we were still polluting. We're burning lots of wood. There's lots of smoke and soot being released out into the atmosphere, but not like the industrialized spewing out bunches of coal, all right? So these moths, these peppered moths, were kind of mottled or speckled colored and camouflaged to blend in to the trees that they live on. So a bird seeing this moth that's blending in, well, it's technically not seeing that moth because it's camouflaged pretty well, right? As the environment shifts and as things get considerably more dirty, as we're spewing out this soot, the trees get blackened. There are variation within these moths. Some of them lighter colored, some of them this original population, and a few of them darker, right? So as these trees get very dirty, the darker colored moths are more successful because they blend in better and the birds don't pick them off. The lighter colored moths, now they stick out and the birds see them very easily. They swoop down, feed on them, and take a lot of them out of the population. So now you got more darker moths on these darker trees, and they're the most successful. And they reproduce more, producing more darker moths, all right? So they become the dominant population after natural selection, which makes me back it up for a second and say, wait a minute, is that actually natural selection? Weren't we the ones spewing out all of this pollutant? Maybe it's really an artificial, right, selection. We're the ones that drove this shift in this population. We're not going to get bogged down with that right now, but I think that's maybe a little more accurate, all right? So after we kind of move through this industrialized period and start thinking about the environment and maybe cleaning up our ways a little bit, not spewing out so much coal soot, the environment cleans up a bit, right? As we think about cleaner fuels and using these resources a little better, not polluting as much, we shifted. And the trees ultimately are cleaner than they were in this original population where we're burning all of the wood, right? And so we've now shifted, if we could get another figure up in here, we've shifted this population from these guys to the dark ones to a new population that should be over here that's lighter than the speckled moth. And it's the dominant type of moth that survives the best on these cleaner barked trees, right? So it's went two different ways, right? As long as that variation is still within the population, the potential for this adaptation, the potential to shift is there. If all you have are these dark moths, and that's all their genes say, that's all you've got. And if we do shift our ways and become cleaner, those dark moths are going to get decimated because they no longer blend in and they're fed upon, right? Definitely setting the stage for problems, right? So the genetic drift is a way that we can see change in a population. And genetic drift is a chance event. It's something that happens, but it's not, it's not the result of, it's one small occurrence that causes this to happen, all right? So we've got a couple of generations here, 3 generations. Rabbits breed very rapidly. If you haven't heard that, well, they do. Now you learned something today, right? So our first generation, right? We can look at these things and technically we could do some math, we could do some statistics, and we could start calculating up these probabilities and the frequency of distribution of these respective genes in the population. We're not going to worry about that, all right? So there's different genes, the dominant and the recessive, P for dominant, Q for recessive, capital and lowercase letters when we express them, right? So we're seeing coat color in these rabbits. We've got homozygous dominant, 2 capital A's. We've got some heterozygous, so capital and lowercase. And then we've got these little albino rabbits down below, homozygous recessive, 2 lowercase letters, all right? So we could count up the capitals and the lowercase letters. These are the respective genes in this population. We could calculate them up and see it's 50-50. Half of them are big A, half of them are little a. The way they look is different. And the way the albinos in this population, well, they're just a small little smattering of the rest of the normal looking rabbits, if you will, all right? But 50-50 distribution, all right? Our second generation, if we look at these guys and they're reproducing, all right, now we've got some homozygous dominant, we've got heterozygous. As we look at the second generation, now we've got variation, but we've got a little less of that homozygous recessive, all right? Now in this case, if we randomly grab 2 rabbits, these 2, and say you're going to be the ones reproducing, the 2 we grabbed are both homozygous dominant, both capital A's, right? We let them reproduce. All you can get are homozygous rabbits. We've lost all of this variation. There is no heterozygotes and there's no homozygous recessive ones. This is genetic drift. For these 2 were randomly or whatever, maybe all of these in that population died. And it's only these 2 that survived, right? That is more like a bottleneck, which is also a type of genetic drift, all right? This with drift is just a random occurrence. These 2 rabbits were the ones that reproduced, and this next population, it's all the same because the variation accidentally, randomly, however you want to describe it, just by simple chance, that variation was lost, all right? Because the 2 dominant, homozygous dominant individuals were the ones that created this next generation, all right? So drift is a chance event, right? We could flip it around the other way, and we could think of it as, like these recessive ones, the white rabbits. Maybe they stick out in this population and they're easily preyed upon. So they get consumed by some predator and now they're taken out of the mix. Well, as long as you've got some heterozygous ones in there, the potential to see some more of them showing up is there. But if it's not that case, if it's not a matter of Mendelian genetics, it could be lost very easily, right? And once it's all the same, the potential to adapt and change is considerably diminished, right? There's issues for sure. Okay, and you can see up above the frequencies. I wasn't really talking about that, but they've changed. There's more of the dominant, the capital letter, less of the lowercase, and over here it's completely gone, right? It's just dominant alleles. All right, we will stop with that. Do we stop at 10:45 or 10:15? 45? We won't stop at that then. I wanted it to end. I'm like, this is a good stopping point. It's not. Okay. You need just a little bit more, right? Maybe you don't. You're like, I'm ready to pack it up. All right. So genetic drift chance events, all right? A bottleneck that I mentioned just a second ago, it is a type of genetic drift, right? In these circumstances, it's usually some sort, this bottleneck, it's some sort of natural disaster, something that wipes out a bunch of the population, and what you're left with is just a few. It could be an ice age event. It could be on an island, some gigantic volcanic eruption, and it wipes out almost everything in this population, and you're left with just a handful, right? Kind of flipping it back to just those two rabbits. That's what you got from they were both homozygous dominant, right? Could be, right? So here we've got an original population. There's all of these beans within this population or marbles, and there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of different colors, right? In this bottleneck event, you get a few of them that survive. And in this case, we don't get any of the red ones. There's some orange and some green, right? The red ones potentially are completely lost. If that variation is gone, this is what we're left with, right? And after this catastrophic event, and we've lost a huge amount of variation within that genome, or that gene pool, I should say, now the potential to adapt, to change, to survive is diminished, right? There are numerous things that we might think about as some of these possibilities. Cheetahs are one example. They survived, a handful of them survived the ice age about 10,000 years ago. And it really was, well, maybe a couple handfuls. They think probably about a dozen cheetahs survived that ice age. And they are the ancestors to the living cheetah today. The genetic variability within the population of cheetah is very poor. There are a lot of issues. There are a lot of genes that are the same, and we think of inbreeding lending to bigger problems because the genetic issues get amplified or magnified over the course of generations. And if we start thinking all homozygous, dominant, or recessive, one way or the other, it's all the same genes for this specific characteristic, there is no potential for adaptation or change within that specific trait that we're evaluating. Cheetahs are spiraling toward extinction because of the tremendous lack of genetic variability, right? They speculate within our lifetimes, cheetahs will no longer be present on the planet. We see extinctions occurring all of the time, right? And oftentimes they go undetected, some sort of crazy microbe or something like that. Mammals are a little more visible. These are things that maybe are more of an alarm bell going off saying, wait a minute, all right? But we are definitely seeing results of extinctions being considerably more elevated than what we would classify as just normal natural background extinction rates, right? Which is also disturbing, right? And we'll hit later this thought of the sixth mass extinction, which is what we're in right now. It's hard to visualize it when you're right in the middle of it, right? So the genetic drift are chance events, all right? Gene flow, we might think of it as another type of chance event. Gene flow is where we've got some sort of migratory event, right? It might be one way, it could be two-way gene flow. If we get some of the green guys moving to the brown population, that would be a two-way gene flow. In this circumstance, we get one moving into this new population, and it brings with it genetic variation. If these are able to breed with those, then we may see some that are a mixture of the two, right? Variation through gene flow contributes change within this population, right? It is kind of, gene flow is kind of a fancy way to say sex, but it's not just sexual reproduction, right? It is someone from some other area being transplanted and reproduction occurring, right? Because otherwise it's just reproduction, right? But gene flow is the movement into a new population and reproduction happening. And that can contribute some potentials to that population. And it also, gene flow helps to keep these two looking more similar as we get genetic exchange, especially if it's two-way gene flow. It helps to keep these two populations looking more like one, all right, more similar. And there are other possibilities where maybe gene flow can't occur. And now you've got two populations that are distinct. They're separated, they're cut off from one another, and they each accumulate their own sorts of genetic changes, differences. And they may get to the point that they no longer could reproduce, even if you brought them together. At that point, they're two different species, even though we could flash back, a handful of years and say they were the same species. Once they can't reproduce, they're technically different species, at least with some of our definitions. The biological species concept talks about sexually reproducing organisms. And that is a big factor when we think about those potentials to reproduce or maybe not, right? So I mentioned that oftentimes when we think about evolution, we try to look at fossil remains. We try to see variation from extinct lineage and try to see some of the similar features or traits in present organisms and make some speculations. Oftentimes, as we go through and look at some of these fossil records, they speculate and talk about missing links. This some ancestor that sets the stage to giving rise to other ancestors over the course of time. And can this thing show these similarities or differences potentially between two different groups, a link in between them, right? As far as fossil lineage goes, horses are a type of animal that are highly preserved, well documented. Their ancestry can be traced back millions of years. And I think that's pretty impressive, all right? As we think about them, the early horses were very different than horses of today, all right? But there are definite similarities as we go back and look at some of this. There is a horse in Hagerman, so just west, headed toward Twin Falls, the Hagerman horse that is somewhere within this fossil lineage right around here, I'm thinking, in between these guys. You don't have to go clear there. You can go down to the Student Union, to the Museum of Natural History and see some of this. Maybe they switched it up a bit, but at least it was down there a little bit ago, where you can see a fossil dig of the Hagerman horse and some of the fossils on display as well. So the horses have changed and adapted over the course of millions of years, from like a small or mid-sized dog shape to very large. if we, and we will see a little bit later, bone structures, if we were to look at their hooves, when we look over here, there's a handful of toes. As we look to the modern horse, a single toe, right? A hoof. And this adaptation, this growing size and fusing of bones has occurred over the course of millions of years as they adapt to different habits and habitats. Still grazing, but the types of stuff they grazed on, the ability to get bigger, to move faster, set the stage for all of these changes over the course of, again, many generations, right? So there are also, if we were to look at these over the course of time, we could see other kind of branching points where you get some diversification and extinction events of other that are distinct and no longer able to reproduce. But if we trace it back, this seems to be a linear progression as well. We could slap ourselves on this timeline and see some similar sorts of ideas as we think about this progression, right? And we could look at others as well, and we'll see that. I think that's the next chapter where we see some of that diversity. So this is an example of similarities, common ancestry, homologous features, so similar features that show, again, ancestry. So looking at all of these animals, we can see appendages, our arms, and we've color-coded some bones to show the similarities across the board. We could have a picture of the horse up here as well and talk about it, but it would be better to back it up to here where we've got handfuls of toes, right? Although we could still discuss it right here with the single hoof, right? So they've color-coded all of this, your digits, your fingers or phalanges, the carpals and metacarpals up in here making up your wrist, and radius and ulna making up your arm bones. And we see them, it's not the same shapes, but the same bones, whether we're talking a whale, a bird, ourselves, or maybe Fido, your little dog. There are similarities with all of these, all right? And the way that the bones are, the shapes might vary the littlest bit. There could be some fusing occurring with that as well, but it's similar, showing the vertebrates, those that have bony skeletons, all arising from a similar common ancestor. This ancestry was shared, and it doesn't matter if you're talking whales or people, right? It doesn't matter if you're talking people or birds, right? It's similar, right? Whether you think you're like a bird or not, right? I would hope we think we're not, right? But there's definitely some possibilities, right? This example is different, right? So not homologous, similar features. This is different types of characteristics based off of environmental pressures. So the Arctic fox with its white coat, or the ptarmigan's plumage with its white plumage, both adaptations to blend into their environment, all right? Different ancestry that's setting the stage for coat variation or plumage, whatever, we'll still call it coat. But similar traits, it's the environment, right? We could flip it back to those rabbits and we could think about like a snowshoe hare. The snowshoe hare in the winter, it loses its darker coat and a white coat shows up to blend in with the snow. As the snow starts to melt, as spring is nearing, it loses the white coat and gets a kind of brownish coat to blend into the soil. In both circumstances, the environment is a selective pressure that sets the stage for that. right? There's an example with Siamese cat. I think it's maybe a little bit cruel, but you could do it a little differently, right? The Siamese cat, kind of like these, it's temperature dependent with its fur. And colder parts of the body, it's kind of the opposite. They get darker, all right? So the trunk of the Siamese cat is usually pretty light colored. Its paws, its ears, and its nose are darker, all right? You can have two cats, and I had a student tell me this was her situation, right? You could take, before I tell you her situation, you could take a Siamese cat, you could shave the hair on the cat's back, and you could put an ice pack on that back of the cat and let it sit there for 15 or 20 minutes. All of those skin cells are like, brr, right? This is cold. And it's also been shaved bald. As the hair gets stimulated to start to grow, all of those skin cells have been chilled for a little bit, and that patch where the ice pack was grows in super dark. It will, over the course of time, lighten up as that hair falls out and gets replaced, ultimately, all right? So you could make a little spotted cat if you were so inclined. I'm pretty sure your cat's not going to tolerate that, right? Probably not going to tolerate letting you shave it in the first place, all right? And then slapping an ice pack on it, probably not, all right? So it could happen, right? I had a student that had two Siamese cats. I'm assuming one was good kitty and one was bad kitty, because good kitty got to stay in the house, and bad kitty, well, you're an outside cat now, right? That's what you get. You start pooping in the plants, done deal. You live outside, right? I don't know if that's what happened, right? I assume good kitty lays on the windowsill, cleaning herself, looking out and taunting bad kitty, saying, look at me, I'm in here watching TV, right? You're outside getting chased by a dog, right? Good kitty was nice and light colored, right? Her appendages, her paws and her ears, the extremities that are a little bit colder, they're still darker, all right? But bad kitty that's living outside, the whole trunk of his body is very, very dark, right? And if you have outside cats, you sometimes see some of that variation. But Siamese cats are very good to show you that, right? And I think with them, maybe it's the opposite, and the coat comes in darker to absorb more heat as they're outside, instead of trying to blend in and hide in the snow. They want to get more, they want the sun, right? So they've got darker plumage or darker hair. I'm looking at the plumage. All right. So here is some corn, right? And this is ancestor to corn, as we're looking at it right here. And this Proteaceae family of plants before Gondwana broke up, we see these plants colonizing, and then as the continents start to shift, we can see it on different continents. This also fits kind of that biogeography idea as we go back and think about plate tectonics and all of that. Where do we see these things? If we see them on multiple types of continents, we could say, well, that must have occurred when they were all together in order to see this. You can, although we're looking at this right here and thinking about this potential, we could look at these continents, and with Gondwana all together, Australia starts to break off as the placental mammals are evolving. Australia doesn't get them. It's all marsupial mammals, right? The pouched mammals, because the placentals start to evolve after Australia had been broken off. Placental mammals are there now, thanks to us, right? Or not thanks to us, right? It truly depends, right? So definitely some differences with that. Okay, guys, I think that is where I want to stop right now. We'll pick up with some pachyderms, some elephants Thursday. Questions or concerns? Okay, good day. Farewell.